people say, oh, we're facing a retirement crisis because of this or because of this or because of this. Throughout, there's data we can check on this. And we can see how many people are offered retirement plans, how many people are contributing, how much they're contributing, how much retirement savings are, how much retirement incomes are. When you look at those things and you start pulling on the strings of this retirement crisis narrative, it falls apart very, very quickly.
Welcome to Decoding Retirement. We are your first and last stop in your retirement planning journey, your journey where you're planning for or living in retirement. Now, today, many are told that there's a retirement crisis in America, that we haven't saved enough to fund our desired lifestyle, that too few people have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan, and that Social Security is going bankrupt. Well, we have found someone with a contrarian point of view, and that someone is Andrew Biggs. He's the author of The Real Retirement Crisis, and he's also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome, Andrew. Pleasure to have you
Thanks,
here.
Pops. Great to be with you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming on board, and we're going to start off, I think, with a question that I think I know the answer to, but many of our recent guests are now sounding the alarm about the Social Security's trust fund and that Americans might either have to plan for an across-the-board 23% cut in their benefits, or maybe young workers and the yet-to-be-born as well as wealthy Americans might have to plan for a reduction in benefits or higher taxes. And I'm curious for your thoughts on that and what people should do because of it.
Sure. Well, I mean, the theme of my book, the Real Retirement Crisis, is that, in general, we don't face a retirement crisis. I will say that, if Social Security goes insolvent, which is projected to in around 2033, and if you cut benefits across the board by 20%, that in fact would be a retirement crisis, because there's a lot of low income seniors who depend heavily on Social Security. In reality, that's very, very unlikely to happen. I mean, mathematically, we do either have to pay more into the system or receive less out of it. Obviously, the sooner Congress does something about it, the better off we are. But, Congress has known about this long-term funding gap literally for over 40 years. And every year, including this year, they choose to kick the can down the road. And that just makes the problems more difficult to solve. So, the real retirement crisis, as I say in the book, is not on what we call household retirement savings, people saving through 401ks or IRAs or pensions. The real retirement crisis is almost entirely on the governmental side. It's Social Security, it's state and local government pensions. That's true in the U.S. It's true around the world.
Right. So what advice would you give to folks who are planning for a potential either increase in taxes or reduction in benefits? Is there things that a certain segment of Americans should do?
If you're a lower income American, to be honest, I would say really don't worry about it. Especially if you're somebody, say, age 50 today who's approaching retirement. I really just wouldn't worry about it, because there's nobody out there who's proposing you get a 20% cut in your benefits. In fact, most of the Social Security reform proposals from Democrats or Republicans would either keep benefits in place for low earners or sometimes actually increase them. If you're somebody in the middle or at the top of the income distribution, what you might want to do to prepare for Social Security's financing problems is save a little bit more in your 401k today. Save an extra percentage point or two towards retirement every year. Now, if we decide to fix Social Security by raising taxes, you can sort of dial back your contributions, because those higher taxes will enable the system to pay higher benefits. But if, on the other hand, solvency is addressed by reducing benefits, you'll be prepared. So that's something I think that people can reasonably do today to sort of protect them against whatever might happen in the future.
Yeah. So, Andrew, I want to turn back to your book. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book is this notion of the life cycle model and how that could or should influence people as they think about whether there's a crisis or not. Talk more about that.
Well, the life cycle model is sort of the workhorse model for how economists think about people's decisions on borrowing, saving, spending. And what the life cycle model says is you're going to sort of allocate the resources you have over your lifetime to the parts of your life where they do you the most good. So somebody who is very young and their income is very low they're not going to be saving for retirement. Often they're going to be borrowing because that helps raise their standard of living a bit. Once you get to your mid 30s or so, and the height of your career, then you're no longer borrowing. Then you start to save quite a bit. And that reduces your standard of living. It keeps it even with what you had when you were younger, but it helps you amass resources. So when you retire, you can live off of those savings. So it's not incredibly different from what financial planners think about in terms of, say, retirement income replacement rates, where you want to be able to maintain the standard of living you had before retirement. But what it does, and I discuss this in a couple chapters in the book, is it does give some predictions about what might happen when children enter the household and how does that affect people's need to save for retirement. It gives you some idea of what the spending path in retirement will be. Often financial planners assume you're going to save the same amount or you're going to spend the same amount every year throughout retirement from 65 to 75 to 85 and beyond. Evidence shows that's not what people do. They tend to spend more early in retirement and they spend dramatically less as they get older. It's not because they're running out of money, it's because people derive less utility, less enjoyment from taking a worldwide cruise at age 95 than they do at 65. So it gives you some different sorts of predictions. And when you account for those are some of the reasons why the retirement savings situation for Americans is so much more positive than a lot of people think it is.
Yeah. We've had David Blanchett on where we talked about his research that he did at Morningstar, with the SMILE research. And in that discussion, we talked about the research that Michael Hurd did over at the Rand Corporation, where he
Yes.
shows that, right, spending declines on a real basis, 1% to 2% per year, which to my way of thinking means that you may either be oversaving or investing more aggressively than you should, given that your spending is going to decline in your retirement years.
Well, I mean, if you rely on the work by Mike Hurd and his co-author Susanna Rowetter, they're both out of the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica. They're excellent researchers. And what they find is when you account for the actual spending paths that people have in retirement, where they're declining a little bit each year, the amount of wealth they need at retirement is about 16% lower than if they were having steady spending throughout retirement. But that has an even larger effect. If you assume, say, half of your income will come from Social Security, that means the amount of savings you need, say, in your 401k or IRA at retirement, isn't 16% lower, it's 32% lower. These are dramatic effects when we simply look at the data. And one of the points I make throughout the book is people say, "Oh, we're facing a retirement crisis because of this, or because of this, or because of this." Throughout, there's data we can check on this. And we can see how many people are offered retirement plans, how many people are contributing, how much they're contributing, how much retirement savings are, how much retirement incomes are. When you look at those things and you start pulling on the strings of this retirement crisis narrative, it falls apart very, very quickly.
Yeah. Now, I think I've listened to you speak in the past where you've described the crises as not universal, that there's no crisis for those in the lowest income quintiles nor in the highest income quintiles, but perhaps maybe in the middle where people aren't quite sure of how much they need to save. They've been given rules of thumb like you need 10 times your final year salary set aside at retirement to fund your desired lifestyle, or you need, as you mentioned, 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income to fund your lifestyle. Are we misleading people with those numbers by chance, given that consumption declines over the course of retirement?
Oh, the standard sort of replacement rate rules of thumb, I mean, they're not terrible. They are misleading in the sense that they assume people want steady consumption in retirement. But the reality is, if you look at data on the replacement rates people actually have, the vast majority are over that 70% benchmark that's commonly cited. You have especially if you're looking at lower income people, often they have higher incomes in retirement than they do previous to retirement, but even at the middle and the high end, it's really only a high end where replacement rates get down to that sort of 70 to 80% range. Even in the middle, they tend to be quite a bit higher. Again, these are things we just need to check. And I came out of the policy office at the Social Security Administration. We use very, very sophisticated models for projecting what people's future retirement incomes, future replacement rates will be. And those really what turned me around on this idea of the retirement crisis, and this is 20 years ago, was the career employees at Social Security were reading these articles in the newspaper about the retirement crisis and so is predicting it. And they're like, our model's not showing that. Now, what they tend to show is replacement rates for typical retirees in the future. The replacement rates of your retirement income as a percentage of your pre retirement earnings are going to be pretty similar to what they are today. And there is no retirement crisis today. Retirees are a very well off part of the population, whether you look at their incomes, their wealth, their poverty rates, or if you simply ask them, how financially secure do you feel? Can you handle an unexpected expense? There is no crisis today. And if there's not one today, there's very unlikely to be one in the future.
Yeah. So how do you explain, Andrew? I look at like the Employee Benefit Research Institute study, the Retirement Confidence Survey, that each and every year seems to indicate that only 25% of people are very confident. What am I missing?
Oh, well, it is understandable that people will feel nervous about retirement. I mean, if you think, say, if you're 35 years old and you're starting to save for retirement, you have to think about what is the path of my future earnings, which you don't know. You have to think about what is the rate of return I can get on my savings. You have to think, when might I retire? You have to think about how long I might live. And you get one shot to get it right. So, clearly it's a confusing kind of thing. But there's good data from Gallup because they go back for over 20 years, and they will ask working age Americans, how confident are you that in retirement you will have enough money to live comfortably? That's the quote. So it's not just, avoid poverty, it's live comfortably. Usually around 60% of people say yes. But then when they look at retirees themselves, they say, do you have enough money to live comfortably? It's 80% or so. So what that means, you have a big, and we can go back and say, the people 20 years ago who were saying it is 60% confidence in retiring comfortably, they're retired today. And there's other data you can do the same thing. So we know that a lot of people are worrying unnecessarily about retirement. And look, it's a confusing thing. And if they read the newspaper, there is this drumbeat of pessimistic stories about retirement. I mean, I have an automated Google search on the phrase retirement crisis, and it probably gives me 5 media hits a day. And so part of the purpose of writing the book was to give people, some feeling for, okay, what do we mean when we say that? And I have one chapter, I look at all these studies that claim to show your retirement crisis. Again, you pull at the strings of them and it just falls apart. And the various motivations for pushing this narrative, if you're in the news media, if it bleeds, it leads. So there's the incentive. People will
Guilty as
click on that
charged.
story.
Yeah. Right.
But it really is a much, much more kind of confident and optimistic story. And it doesn't mean nobody faces any problems. I'm not being Pollyannish about this. But if you look at a variety of surveys, I mean, this is a nice example of a survey Vanguard did several years ago, where they asked retirees, do you think the nation faces a retirement crisis? And about 60% or so say yes. Then they asked them, would you consider your own financial situation a retirement crisis? And only 4% say yes. It's everybody thinks everybody else faces a retirement crisis, but consistently, and there's other surveys like from the Federal Reserve, it's only about 5% of people in retirement who say, I'm really, really struggling. That's a solvable problem. That's a really an easily solvable problem. And we need to focus on the problems we have and solve them, not scare ourselves to death with problems that really don't exist.
All right, Andrew, I'm beginning to feel more optimistic than I was at the start of our conversation. So thank you for that. We have to take a short break. And when we come back, I want to talk about a problem that is also in the news that I'm sure you have some thoughts about, the coverage issues in the 401k market. Don't go away. Welcome back to Decoding Retirement. I'm speaking with Andrew Biggs. He's the author of a new book called The Real Retirement Crises. He's also a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Andrew, before we took a break, I promised that we would talk about a problem that is often mentioned in the news, which is that the 401k plans are inadequate for a couple reasons, one of which there are many reports that suggest that only 50% of workers are covered by an employer-sponsored plan like a 401k, and thus half of working Americans may not be saving for retirement. I'm sure you have some thoughts about that too, right? Maybe some optimistic
Yes.
notes.
Well, there's a difference between coverage and participation. If you look in Bureau of Labor Statistics data, where they contact employers and ask them about their retirement plans, it's this year somewhere around 72% of private sector employees are offered a retirement plan at the job. Most of those cases will be 401k. We have some 403bs, some remaining DB plans. So it's about three-quarters of employees are offered a retirement plan, and a little over half of those participate in the plan. Now, they're different issues. One is, do you have the opportunity to save at work? And the vast majority of people today do. And of those who don't, it tends to be disproportionately younger and lower income workers who, again, in your life cycle model, have less need to save, and so they place less demand on their employers to provide these. Employers are trying to provide the benefits that matter to their employees. Some of these statistics that show much lower coverage rates are often done from what we call household surveys. Somebody shows up at your door, calls you on the phone, and asks you, are you offered a 401k at work? When I was at Social Security, I think the work came out slightly after I left, but they did a study where they looked at these surveys where people asked, "Are you offered a retirement plan? Do you participate in it?" And then they matched those survey responses up to income tax data, which showed whether they're in a plan or not. And what they found is a lot of people answered these questions wrong. And so when they used income tax data for these very same people, the participation rate rose from about 50% to about 62%. So we do have, I have a chapter in the book called The Crisis in Retirement Data, that a lot of these data we think, we just assume the numbers are correct, and they're not. So it really is making sure you're looking at reliable data. Data coming from employers is going to be more reliable than when somebody knocks on your door or calls you on the phone. There's definitional issues, say for instance, the the definition of income in the Census Bureau uses when they're calculating, say, the poverty rate for seniors only counts what's called a regular income. And so if you have irregular withdrawals from an IRA or 401k, that's not counted as part of your income, which is silly. If instead you look at IRS data where they do count as income, the poverty rate in old age drops from 10% to 6%. So there's a real issue there of it's not just people panicking, it's a lot of the data we use are not accurate. So the coverage issue, if your question is, are most people who should be saving for retirement actually saving for retirement? The answer to that is yes. Not all of them. And, I'm fine with something like what you have in the UK where everybody's offered a retirement plan. Although, we got to think about the downsides of that, but I'm okay with it. But if you look at IRS data and say, okay, the percentage of, say, married couples, who are probably have are the age and the income level that they should be saving for retirement, over 80% of them are, in fact, saving for retirement. So this retirement coverage gap or participation gap is simply a lot smaller than people think it is.
Yeah. I know that you're fond of noting that the data is faulty in the book and in speeches where I've heard you speak. And I know that others agree with you, the Alicia Minnells and the Olivia Mitchells of the world agree that the data is faulty. But given that the data is faulty, I look at it a couple ways. One is the law of large numbers says the data is faulty, but I still have to have the law of one number, which is me. And what do I do in spite of the faulty data? Just focus on myself and not whether there's coverage problem issues or whether Social Security will cut my benefits or not. Right? I have to focus on myself, right, in terms of my own personal retirement security.
Well, sure. And, it's as if they say, if you're unemployed, there is a depression going on,
Right.
and so your own circumstances matter. But it is worth looking at, for instance, if we look at survey data of people who are actually retired today, and whether you actually look, are they in poverty or do they say they're having severe financial problems? The answer to those are generally no. Overwhelmingly, seniors will tell you they are doing pretty well financially. So, if you have a difficult circumstance, let's say you're at the age and income range where you really do need to be saving for retirement, but your employer doesn't offer a retirement plan, that is a legitimate issue for you. At the same time, though, I mean, I've gone into, say, Federal Reserve data, and I've looked at people who have reached retirement without any sort of formal retirement plan. They don't have a 401k, they don't have a pension. You would think this is the group. If there's any group that really faces problems, this would be it. Even they have total incomes equal to about 90% of their incomes just prior to retirement, the 90% replacement rate. And the reason is, I mean, some of those folks without a retirement plan tend to be very low income, so they're getting a high replacement rate from Social Security. Others tend to be people like farmers, small businessmen, where they have sources of retirement income outside of formal retirement plans. And so some of these, frightening statistics of only so many people have retirement savings, some of them will exclude people who have, accruals under DB plans. They also exclude people who save in different ways. The Federal Reserve has a nice survey where they ask about broad sources of savings for retirement. 401k, a defined benefit pension. But they also say, do you have a small business? Do you have real estate? Other assets and taxable retirement accounts that are going to provide you with income in retirement. And in the most recent data, somewhere around 90% of Americans approaching retirement have some form of retirement savings. So a lot of it is you just got to get the numbers right. And, the amount of times I hear statistics being used, nearly half of Americans approaching retirement have no retirement savings. Those numbers are simply wrong. I mean, it's really not even a matter of interpretation. They're just wrong. Some people want to have a system where everything is dictated, down to the penny. Our retirement system is messy, but what it does is it actually results in a lot more retirement savings than most other countries. And having a ton of retirement savings will get you a long way. It'll overcome a lot of other mistakes.
Yeah. Andrew, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and wisdom with our viewers and our listeners. It's greatly appreciated, and I can't wait to have you come back on a future episode.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Happy to come back anytime.
Great. So that wraps up this episode of Decoding Retirement. We hope we provided you with some actionable advice to help you plan for or live in retirement. And remember, if you've got questions about retirement, about money, we're here to help. Email me at yfpodcasts@yahooinc.com, and we'll do our best to answer your question in a future episode. And lastly, remember, you can listen to Decoding Retirement on all your favorite podcast platforms.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.